Sometimes, the scariest things you confess in therapy don't come from you. Story 1. The plush armchair in Dr. Albright's office was starting to feel like a second skin. I'd sunk into it every Tuesday at 3 p.m. for the past 6 months, pouring out the anxieties that coiled in my gut. He had a way of listening, a gentle nod, a softly spoken observation that felt like he was untangling the knots in my brain. But lately, something felt off. It began with the silence. He'd always been a man of few words, but now, the silence is stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I'd find myself filling them, my words tumbling out faster, more desperately, as if to ward off the growing unease. Then came the repetition. His favorite phrases, the ones I'd initially found so comforting, started to feel like worn-out grooves. "That's a very interesting perspective," he'd say, his eyes, always a calm, assessing blue, seeming to glaze over. "And how does that make you feel?" he'd ask, the question losing its gentle probe and sounding more like a programmed response. One Tuesday, I noticed his hands. They were resting on his lap, perfectly still, but the nails seemed almost unnaturally clean, too polished, and the way he folded his fingers, interlacing them with a precision I'd never recalled. It was a subtle detail, almost insignificant, but it prickled at the back of my neck. "I've been having these dreams," I confided, wanting to steer the conversation away from the awkward pauses. "About being trapped in a room, and the walls are closing in." Dr. Albright leaned forward, his gaze fixed on me. "Trapped," he repeated, his voice a low murmur. "And what do you think that represents?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe feeling stuck in my life? Unable to move forward?" He smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Or perhaps," he said, his voice taking on a slightly different cadence, softer, almost hypnotic. "Perhaps you are simply afraid of what happens when the walls open." The shift in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the comforting Dr. Albright I knew. It was something else. That night I couldn't shake his words. The walls opening, the image of the office, the familiar armchair, the grandfather clock, flashed in my mind. Then, I remembered another detail. The painting on the wall behind his desk. A serene landscape, always. But as I recalled it, I realized I couldn't quite see the details. The trees were indistinct blurs, the sky an indeterminate gray. It was as if my memory of it was as hazy as his recent silences. The following Tuesday, I walked into the office with a knot of dread in my stomach. Dr. Albright was already seated, his hands folded on his lap, his nails gleaming. As I sat down, I deliberately met his gaze, searching for the man I thought I knew. "Dr. Albright," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about that dream, and about what you said." He inclined his head, that same unnerving stillness about him. "Yes?" "The walls opening," I continued. "It doesn't feel like freedom. It feels exposed, vulnerable, like something is waiting outside." He didn't respond immediately. The grandfather clock began to chime, each resonant bong echoing in the sudden, suffocating silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper, barely audible. "Waiting," he echoed. Then, his eyes flickered, and for a split second, I saw not the calm blue I was used to, but something deep, dark, and utterly alien. They always are, dear, especially for those who are ready to finally see. And then, I noticed it. The portrait on the wall. It wasn't a landscape. It was a portrait of him. Dr. Albright, younger, but unmistakably him. And behind him, faintly painted, almost an afterthought, were two figures. They stood in the shadows, their faces obscured, but their forms were disturbingly familiar. They looked like me, or rather, versions of me, younger and older, and in their eyes, a shared expression of terrified resignation. The grandfather clock finished its chime. Dr. Albright's smile widened, no longer tight, but a glacial, predatory curve. "You're beginning to understand," he murmured, his voice no longer soft, but laced with a chilling amusement. "The room isn't closing in on you. It's revealing what's already inside, and outside, always outside." My own blood ran cold as I realized the truth. I wasn't here to be healed. I was here to be prepared. Story 2. The chipped porcelain mug felt cool against my palms, a stark contrast to the clammy sweat on my forehead. Dr. Albright's office was always a peculiar mix of comfort and subtle unease. The worn leather armchair, the gentle hum of the air purifier, the framed diplomas, all designed to inspire trust. Yet lately, a whisper of something wrong had begun to creep in, like a draft under a sealed door. It started with the repetition, not just his therapeutic methods, which were, I'd been told, standard cognitive behavioral therapy. No, it was the phrasing. Little things at first. "And how did that make you feel?" he'd ask, his voice a low, sonorous rumble. A perfectly normal question, of course, but then, a week later, "So, you felt that way?" And the week after, "Tell me more about how you felt." It felt less like genuine inquiry and more like he was prompting, trying to elicit a specific response. Then came the mirroring. I'd mention a childhood memory, a particularly vivid one of my dog, Buster, chasing squirrels in the backyard. The next session, he'd describe a client's similar experience, but with eerie precision, incorporating details I hadn't shared. "This other person you remind me of," he'd say, his eyes glinting behind his spectacles, "had a dog, too. A terrier mix, I believe, always after the squirrels. My terrier mix, Buster, hadn't been a secret. But still, the unnerving specificity gnawed at me. One Tuesday, the unease solidified into something colder. I was recounting a nightmare, a recurring one about being lost in a labyrinth. The walls were so cold, I'd murmured, tracing the rim of my mug. Dr. Albright leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cold," he repeated, his eyes fixed on mine. "Like the tiles in a bathhouse. Or an operating theater." My blood ran cold. I'd never mentioned a bathhouse, nor an operating theater. I'd never even thought of them. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words, his unnaturally calm gaze. The next session, I decided to test him. I started a story, deliberately vague. "I was walking through a forest," I began, my voice trembling slightly. The air was thick. And then I heard music, very faint. I waited, my heart pounding. Dr. Albright steepled his fingers. "Ah, yes," he said, his voice smooth as always. "Forests. And music. Reminds me of a patient I had years ago. She loved to play the cello in the woods. She found it therapeutic. The cello. I'd told him I played the violin. That was it. The porcelain mug slipped from my numb fingers, shattering on the Persian rug. Dr. Albright didn't flinch. He simply watched the ceramic shards scatter, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. The hum of the air purifier seemed to grow louder, filling the silence. And in that moment, amidst the scattered pieces of my favorite mug, I knew. He wasn't helping me. He was collecting pieces of me, piece by piece, weaving them into a mosaic of other people's pain. And I, it seemed, was just another story in his collection. The truly terrifying part? I had no idea what he was doing with them, Story 3. The worn leather of Dr. Thorne's armchair creaked a familiar lament as I sank into it. It was Tuesday, 4 p.m., the hour I'd come to dread as much as I anticipated it. For months, I'd been wrestling with an anxiety that coiled in my gut like a venomous snake, and Dr. Thorne, with his quiet pronouncements and oddly soothing monotone, was supposed to be my guide. "How has your week been, Eleanor?" His voice, a low rumble, seemed to vibrate through the room, settling the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the blinds. "The same," I admitted, picking at a loose thread on my sleeve. "The tightness. It's still there. Sometimes worse." He nodded, his gaze steady, his eyes a shade of forget-me-not blue that always unnerved me slightly. They seemed to hold a depth I couldn't fathom, a calm that felt almost unnatural. "And when does it feel most acute?" "When I'm alone," I confessed, the words tumbling out. "Or when I think about things. Past things." He leaned forward, his hands clasped loosely on his desk. "Tell me about one of these things, Eleanor." I hesitated, tracing patterns on my jeans. It was the same story I'd told him a dozen times. The one about the car accident that had claimed my brother, the guilt that clung to me like a shroud. But today, something felt different. As I spoke, his expression remained impassive, not the empathetic nod I usually received, but a blankness that was unnerving. "It's like I can still hear the screech of the tires," I whispered, my voice catching. "And his gasp." Dr. Thorne picked up a pen, turning it over and over in his fingers. "A gasp," he repeated, his voice flat. "You've described his scream before, Eleanor. But today, you've chosen gasp." A chill snaked down my spine, unrelated to the anxiety. Had I said scream? I was sure I'd said gasp. Did I? I thought I said gasp. He offered a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Perhaps. Memory can be a tricky thing." He then pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his drawer, his pen poised. "And what was he wearing that day, Eleanor?" I blinked. He'd never asked for such specific details before. His blue t-shirt. The one with the cartoon rocket." My voice felt thin as I said it, a tremor running through it. When had I last thought of that t-shirt? It felt like a detail I'd suppressed, a minuscule pinprick of memory I'd never touched. Dr. Thorne began to write, his strokes deliberate. As he wrote, I noticed something on his desk, partially obscured by a stack of journals, a small framed photograph. It was blurry, but I could make out two figures. One was a woman, and the other was a young boy. He was wearing a blue t-shirt, a t-shirt with a cartoon rocket. My breath hitched. "Who is that?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. Dr. Thorne looked up, his blue eyes meeting mine. The calm was gone, replaced by something cold and assessing. "That, Eleanor," he said, his voice now devoid of its usual warmth, "is my brother. And he died in a car accident, just like yours." The room seemed to tilt. His brother? But I had no brother. Not anymore. The realization slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't my guilt he was helping me unpack. It was his own. And he was seeing his tragedy reflected in me, projecting it, twisting my memories until they fit his own broken narrative. The snake in my gut uncoiled, not in fear, but in a dawning, horrific understanding of a shared delusion, a therapist and patient lost in the same phantom grief.